in each of these nations, we start to see a resurgence of feminist expression in countries like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. This period was fueled to some extent by the UN's Decade of Women, which was from 1975 to 1985. So external pressure was able to kind of, not force, but encourage Arab states to allow for limited public debate on women's issues. But what we see as well in the same era, the same period, was the rise of Islamic fundamentalist states in a lot of several different parts of the region. And so we end up with both positive and negative indicators when it comes to how women's issues appear publicly in Arab spaces. It was during this period that women activists started to criticize nationalism. And they started to criticize nationalism as a framework that was inherently poorly structured to support a feminist discourse. And the reason for that, they're not saying, don't be nationalist or don't, support your nations, essentially, but that what happens with women's representation within these nationalist discourse is something that was just as problematic as the invisibility that they were fighting before. Women became symbolic metaphors, allegories of nation. And when you become an allegory, when you become a metaphor for nation, it's very difficult to challenge any of your assumptions about national representation. What we start to see is women who were, so we start seeing, lost my train of thought, increases in education. But at the same time, we start to see the negative indicators where we have persistent high fertility and a very low participation of women in the workforce. So this is all happening at the same time, and a part of what starts to be criticized, as I was saying earlier, was how nationalism and how the idea of nation factors into this. The site for the feminist struggle against the national mythification of women has mostly appeared in literature, both poetry and prose. Several Arab women writers have explicitly denounced the martyrdom role in which the woman has been cast, where she's either a symbol of nation or of sacrifice. As early as 1968, the prominent Iraqi poet Nazik al-Malaika wrote a poem entitled Jamila about a real woman, Jamila Buhaydid, who was a revolutionary in Algeria, and she had been captured and tortured by the French. And part of what Nazik al-Malaika was talking about in this poem is that she had become a myth, and her real identity had disappeared. So in this short extract from her poem, she says, "We were convinced they nailed a heroine to the cross, and we sang the glories of martyrdom. They have wounded her with knives, we use words. And the wounds inflicted by one's kin are far deeper than those inflicted by the French." It's a really, it's a fine line. I mean, if any of you have ever had to take a class where you've been asked to read Petrarchan sonnets, then you know what she's talking about. In the Petrarchan sonnets, you have this woman who is an ideal. She is on a pedestal, she's mythified, she's not real. In fact, there's the joke about if you put all of the different characteristics that show up in Petrarchan sonnets and try to draw a woman who looks like that, she's got like stars bursting out of her eyes and flowers coming out of her face, she looks like a monstrosity. And so it's not real. The problem when you set up an ideal like that, it seems positive. Like when you set up something clearly positive representation of a woman. But if an ideal doesn't exist, then real women can't live up to that ideal, and real women lose their chance to be basically represented fully in any type of social or political discourse. Take that sort of, Petrarchan model and apply it now to real women who were, in this case, fighting against French occupation. We don't really know anything about Jamila Buhaydid except how she appears in songs about martyrdom and sacrifice. We don't know anything about her actual identity and her actual motivations. And that's part of what Nazik al-Malaika was trying to argue against, that we can't simply define her as sacrifice to the nation. Another writer, Malaika is only the first in a series of women writers who are openly critical of this. A more recent example is Sahar Khalifa, who is a Palestinian writer. And she, in one of her later novels entitled Bab al-Saha, which refers to a neighborhood in Nablus where her characters live, explicitly rejects the representation of women her novel, the protagonist is speaking to a young man who's trying to essentially get her to agree with his cause. And she says, "Wake up, clever boy. I'm not the mother or the land or the symbol. I'm a person. I eat, drink, dream, make mistakes, get lost, get agitated, suffer, and talk to the wind. I'm not a symbol. I'm a woman." Her denial is further supported by the end of the novel, where the protagonist rejects self-sacrifice for the nation, but accepts and advocates resistance as a form of self-representation. And so there's a fine line, there's a distinction that's being made here that a lot of these women writers are trying to establish and trying to clarify for their audiences. Many Arab women writers are aware that such a process of mythification, now to take us out of the literary, the process of the mythification of women pushes women outside of history. You become a static point in time. You're a representation of nation, of motherhood, of martyrdom, of nationality. You do not move forward. You have no express progress. There is nothing about your character or your identity that can change. And so what happens outside of the literary sphere is an attempt to rewrite history from the perspective of women, or taking these women's narratives into consideration, where they can, once again, become mobile parts of the histories of their own nations and their own cultures. One of the most prominent activists who's been working her entire life to reclaim history in this way is Nawal Saadawi, who is a behemoth of Arab feminism. What she has talked about, and an example is an essay that she wrote entitled "Towards a Strategy of Incorporation." She's arguing for a rereading of Arab history from the standpoint of women. And she says that this is necessary so that they can be aware that the struggle of Arab women against sexual, national, and class oppression is not newly born, and that the Arab women's movement doesn't come from the void and is not modeled on women's movements in the West, but is evident throughout the course of Arab and Islamic history extending over 14 centuries. She has a long history of activism and of essentially actively trying to do what she's been talking about. She was in prison during the Sadat years, and she was released only after his execution. She had to leave Egypt due to threats of violence. She moved back in 1996, and she's now in her 80s. She slept in Tahrir Square every time during the most recent Egyptian revolution. So she's been on the front lines of women's representation and Egyptian identity. A part of her argument about, or for moving back to Egypt in 1996, because people were concerned that, well, what if the threat is still there? And her argument was that she needed to be there to prove that Arab feminism was not something external, was not something that could be removed and taken out and essentially ignored. And so she has been working very actively. She was the first woman in Egypt to run for president of the country under the Mubarak years, which was, I mean, she knew she wasn't going to win. They were the Mubarak years after all. But she was not afraid of making overt public political statements, and she's still obviously not afraid. In re-articulating nationalism and history in these ways, Arab women writers have rejected those monolithic images that we saw at the beginning. The idea that the Arab woman is something singular and easily definable. And instead, what they're doing is stressing the need for agency, their own agency, in cultural production. That they have a role in producing the texts, the literature, the politics of their own nations, and that they deserve to be and should be a part of this ongoing discourse. What we start to see outside of the literary sphere, Arab feminism has seen a move away from the nationalist framework, and now we see it on a more localized level. There has been a dramatic increase in NGOs, non-government organizations, and local organizations that are focusing on fighting for and instituting social change on the local level, such as education, fertility, family planning, policy change. But there's more than just the identification of self within the Arab countries, because we know that we live in a global society now, and that the image of Arab femininity doesn't simply occur and doesn't simply exist in the Arab world. At the same time that Arab feminists are combating monolithic representations of women at home, they're also dealing with the essentializing discourse from outside of the Arab world, from the West primarily. Some scholars, such as Susan Muller-Olkin, have argued that feminism is a distinctly Western tradition and is at odds with Arab culture. And she says only way to solve this problem is to eradicate the culture itself, and that's the only way feminism can take hold. So what we see is Arab feminists like Sandawi and the women we mentioned before are dealing with two monolithic representations